Welcome back, gang. It's Deltia from Deltiasgaming.com here with a Stamina Arcanist build that's absolutely god tier. You're going to want to watch this video where I break down the Arcanist, the core components of how it works, how it's effective in PvP, and how you can use it to dominate the battlefield. In this video, I'm going to break down the pros and cons of the Arcanist PvP build, how the crux system works, what we use, both skills, gears, champion points, race, Mundus Stone, and everything else you need to know about the Arcanist in ESO PvP. First thing you need to know is how is the Arcanist different than other PvP builds? The Arcanist is similar to a Dragon Knight in that it builds up cruxes, similar to how Molten Whip works for the Dragon Knights, with a maximum of 3. You can use crux builders and crux consumers. When you consume or generate crux, typically what happens is it procs important passives. In this build particular, there's a passive that's very important, Faded Fortune, increasing critical damage and critical healing by 12%. More on this later. Also, the developers really want you to use a beam, a very long 4.5 second channel called Fate Carver with 2 different morphs. The PvP morph is Pragmatic Fate Carver. But we're not going to use Fate Carver for this build. So I've been playing this since about March on private servers, PTS, and now the live server. Fate Carver does hit very hard, but it's very hard to get it off. 1, it's a channel, which can be CC'd, interrupt, bash, so on and so forth. 2, you have a shield that limits your vulnerability, but that can be chewed through very, very quick because shields are halved in PvP content with Battle Spirit. And then 3, you have to aim this. And it's like a first-person shooter with a little bit of auto-tracking, but anytime there's elevation, you're not hitting. Anytime the target moves behind line of sight, you're not hitting. And how often in PvP can you sit there for 4.5 seconds and straight do a Goku beam? Not very often. So this build is not using Fate Carver to be very, very effective, so you can take advantage of what it does well without getting chunked while you're sitting there beaming. So we're going to run dual wield on the front, primarily because of the twin blade and blunt passive on the front, giving us incredible bonuses to penetration or increased critical damage or whatever weapon you go with. Our build is going to focus on a passive that the Arcanist has. When I saw this initially, I'm like, wow, we're going to build straight for this, and that's status effects with this. The Psychic Lesion. With the Herald of Tome ability slotted, your attack wounds the mind of heretical knowledge, increasing damage dealt by status effects by 15% and status effect chance by 75%. So this is going to be a status effect heavy build. Another reason we picked dual wield is because of rending slashes with master dual wield, which I'll get to in a little bit later. This skill alone, without any special gear sets, give the hemorrhage status effect. This hits extremely hard in both PvE and PvP. It also does bleed damage and bleed over time. So we're going to lean into status effect heavy damage with rending slash dual wield. It's a perfect fit. Now we're going to work left to right on our bar, and starting with our number 1 key is Rune of Colorless Pool. This is what I consider probably the best single target stun in the game now. It's 15 meter range, it's 4-second duration, it cannot be dodged. It also procs minor brittle and minor vulnerability. You guessed it, a couple of more status effects. It gives like a 1-second delay before stunning an enemy, and it seems like when you get hit by this, you almost can't CC break for a second. It is the most annoying single target stun, and it procs status effects, but it comes with a hefty magic cost. You'll be cognizant of that. Next ability on our bar is Elusive Mist. So I run stage 3 Vampire with this build. Arcanist in and of itself is pretty slow. I like Elusive Mist over the in-class ability that the game wants you to use. The game wants you to use Apocryphal Gate as your mobility tool. The issue with Apocryphal Gate is it has a cooldown. So it does give you 12 to 22 meters to shoot through the portal, but you have to place it. You have a 7-second cooldown, so you can't cast it again. And I didn't find it very, very effective for doing a specifically solo play. In ball groups, group play, where people can go through this with you with a synergy, great. But for the everyday player, Elusive Myth with stage 3 Vampire as the play. The reason why stage 3 Vampire primarily is if you're stage 2 or higher, you get Strikes from the Shadows when you use Elusive Mist, coming out getting 300 weapon and spell damage. Number 2, you get the Undeath passive, reducing your damage taken by up to 30% based on your missing health. So we're going to stack a lot of health with this build, more on that later, making us very, very tanky the lower that we go. The next ability up is Recuperative Treatises. It lasts a very long time, 30 seconds. It comes with a unique buff, giving you Major Brutality, Major Sorcery, regardless of what bar this is on, front or back. It also can generate Crux if you have none, and it gives you Resource Sustain when you're doing damage, and gives your abilities a little bit extra damage as well. This is critical to maintain. I put this on the front of my bar because if you have Herald of the Tome ability slotted on your front bar, which is your damage bar, you get more penetration. So you're gonna have a lot of pen on your front bar if you put it there, but feel free to put on your back bar if this makes more sense for you. The next ability up is your Flail ability. So this is essentially my main spammable damage ability, and it does a lot for you. Be careful, it has a cast time. So if someone's gonna chunk you and you need a block, I would not cast this. It's gonna be 15 by 5 meters, so it's AoE. It's a decent amount of damage. The tooltip is not that high because I'm not fully buffed. It's also gonna heal you. It's gonna immobilize, and it's gonna debuff them with Abyssal Ink for 20 seconds, giving you 5% increased damage to that target. It also acts as an execute, deals up to 100% more damage to enemies with less than 50% health. That is the same amount of execute damage that Whirling Blades does. So this skill acts as a way to debuff a target, a way to hit AoE in single target. It acts as an immobilization, and it acts as an execute. It's our all-in-one spammable, and this is the reason why I do not use the beam. This is 10 times more reliable than Fate Carver, plus it's 15-meter range, so you can play at medium range and do very, very well. We've already talked about Rending Slash. This is your primary dot on your front bar and what you want to maintain at all times. And then we're going to talk about the ultimate, the Tide King's Gaze. This is much more damage than it had been in the past. What it's going to do, 8-second duration, 5-meter radius, 15 meters. It's going to lock onto a target and just burn them to the ground, doing a ton of damage. The trick with using Tide's King Gaze is you want to make sure that you set this ability up with Rune of Colorless Pool. So typically I load some up with a bunch of dots and then boom, hit them with Rune of Colorless Pool to stun them, lock them in place with my tentacle, giving another immobilization right after they're CC'd so they don't run out of the Tide King's Gaze. It does track, but it's not very fast, and you can get out of it if you don't stun them properly. So that is going to be our front bar. We're going to go with the back bar, Destruction Staff, and I'm going to go with Ice. The reason why I use Ice Staff, Ice Staff reduces the cost of blocking by 36% and increases the amount of damage you can block by 20%, which is identical to Sword and Shield. So you get block mitigation. On your back, you can block cast, holding block, keeping yourself alive, being very, very sturdy. And you can use it to rip off fully charged heavy attacks and get back magic. Also, I do not slot the Tri-Focus passive in the Destruction Staff skill line because I want my block to consume stamina, not magic. So make sure you take the 2 points out of this passive, very important. The primary reason we're going to use the Ice Staff or Destruction Staff in general is Elemental Susceptibility. This is going to proc 3 status effects, Burning, Chilled, and Concussed. So if you're tracking so far, we can proc a lot of status effects, and this is also going to give us Major Breach on a single target. It costs nothing, and the range is 35 meters. It's an absolute god tier ability, must have on the back bar for an elemental status effect heavy build. And then we're going to get to the survivability mechanisms of this build. So first up is Crux Weaver's Armor. This is going to give you your armor buff. You want to maintain this at all times. It's 30 seconds. It's also going to proc Minor Breach, which will stack with Major Breach, reducing armor for targets that attack you. And also it generates Cruxes passively. Remember when I talked about generating Crux? This is very critical to your build and understanding that you need to take advantage of this Fated Fortune, both building and consuming Crux almost every 7 seconds when you can to get increased critical damage and critical healing. I'll tell you how to do that in a second. Next ability up is Rune Guard of Freedom, one of my favorite abilities in the game. It's going to give you Minor Resolve. It's going to last for a bit of time, 20 seconds with Minor Protection. The first time you are damaged below 50%, you're going to consume that minor protection and give you a burst heal scaling off your max health. And it's going to give you armor and crowd control immunity for 6 seconds. The CC immunity can happen every 30 seconds, but you can recast this. So essentially what happens is you get chunked from a Nightblade or a burst ulti, boom. It acts as a panic button, allowing you to get CC immunity, zip away with elusiveness, heal yourself back to full, recast it, and get in the fight. Can't say enough about this ability. And now we're going to get to the healing mechanism. I have Resolving Vigor. It's a very low tooltip because I'm not buffed and I don't have a ton of weapon and spell damage. But this is going to give you healing over time. It's a selfish heal. Now, if you see some of this footage, I actually use another heal a lot, and I'll explain an alternative flex spot for group play. But this costs 3,000 stamina. It's a heal over time. It also procs minor resolve, which is a bit redundant for this build, but mainly we're using it because it's a guaranteed heal for yourself. A heal that I used quite a bit of was Evolving Rune Mend. So this is actually your burst heal. It costs an enormous amount of resources, and the resources are reduced by the amount of cruxes that you have. The issue with this specific ability is it goes to yourself or an ally. So you might drop 4,800 stamina on this, and it goes to some pug who's very, very low, and it pops them up, and when you're taking pressure, die. Solo gameplay, I love it, especially if you have 3 cruxes up, but for group play, it was very unreliable, so I stripped it off for Resolving Vigor, but experiment with yourself. My main survivability tool comes from Spite Ward of the Elusive Mind. The other morph gives you a bigger shield for 1 second, and that is useful, but what I found is this is my crux dump. I have a lot of things that build and generate cruxes. This is a 6-second shield. It costs a ton of magic, but if you use it for cruxes, it refunds the cost per crux spent. So you can almost make it a free ability. And I use this almost like an old school magic sword. As soon as I get 3 cruxes and I'm about to engage or I'm in trouble, I consume it to proc that increased critical damage and critical healing and get a shield preemptively. Now it's going to scale off your max health, so you can actually scale a very high amount of max health, do tons of damage with status effects and not weapon and spell damage, and heal a lot by just having a lot of max health. You can experiment with the other morph, but I found for magic resource sustain, it's best to take this one because you are pretty magic heavy. So what you're going to do is use Resolving Vigor for a heal over time, a big shield, especially if you have cruxes. You're going to maintain Rune Guard of Freedom, so that way if you get chunked, you get a free heal and your armor buff. And then our back bar ultimate of choice is Sanctum of the Abyssal Sea. This is just like, you're not going to die for a little bit of time. It gives you a massive shield. Plus, when it collapses the shield, it'll do damage back. So you can actually preemptively cast this for 10 seconds, jump in the fight, and just fight it out with people, and they'll be taking damage as well. A group play option is Glyphic of the Tide, which is your healing ulti. This thing heals and gives a unique weapon and spell damage, but it's not mobile. So when in doubt, you're playing solo or you're playing in a group, pick this up, get this morph, you'll be very, very survivable. So that's the skills. I'm going to show you the rotation and how to pressure folks with this and how you keep yourself alive, but let's go over the gear so you understand the core components of status effects and you probably know what's coming. So for gear, we're going to go with an arena weapon loadout. So the reason I do this is you're going to take advantage of the status effects and lean into that versus a typical weapon and spell damage build. The first one we're going to go with is Master's Dual Wield. So Perfected Stinging Slashes. You can do normal. You can even solo normal to get a lesser version of this. And what this is going to do is give you a little crit chance on your front, and it's going to deal more damage with Twin Slashes, aka Ren. So it's going to make that very, very hard hitting. I'll give you an option if you don't want to use arena weapons when this is done, but this is highly recommended. The Vatashram Master setup, meta setup we've been running for a long time. Our back bar is going to be Frost Staff, Perfected Wraith of Elements coming from veteran Vatashram Hollows. This with the elemental susceptibility is just going to lock on a target like a laser beam and do a whole lot of damage while you're locked on. You want to proc this and then stun the target in place so they don't break the beam. That's really critical to get the most out of this pressure. You're using elemental susceptibility, it makes sense to use this on your back bar as well. On the body at all times, I'm going to be using Mara's Bomb. So Mara's Bomb was recently nerfed, so the proc can only happen every 30 seconds instead of every 15 seconds, cleansing negative effects. But the healing is still substantial, and it's a heavy armor set that I like on my body at all times. So I run 2 jewelry, 3 heavy on the body, Mara's Bomb, 1 reinforced in the chest, the rest well fitted. So don't sleep on Mara's Bomb, it's still really, really good. A couple of sets you can run instead of Mara's Bomb is Daedric Trickery. Daedric Trick Daddy! And Daedric Trickery is just going to give you major buffs, like major protection, major expedition, mending, heroism, or vitality. So you can rotate those defensive buffs and you can stack them on top of each other, and it's craftable, very easy to get a hold of. Another set you can get a hold of is Trial by Fire. While under the effect of an elemental status effect, you gain 8,500 armor. This is going to make you very, very tanky just passively. Also a staple in defensive sets is Mark of Pariah. Also a heavy armor set coming from Rothgar. You can buy this on the traders. It's going to give you physical and spell resist resistance, up to 10,200 based on your missing health. This is God tier paired with Vampire Stage 3. So that's going to be your 5 set on the body at all times. You're going to run 2 arena weapons, and then you're going to have 2 one pieces that both give max health. Armor of the Trainee, and then Druid's Braid. Those one pieces are going to go on your belt and gloves typically. And then you're going to go with a monster helm of your choice. I like Roska the Warp. This is God tier resource sustain. So it's kind of like Death Dealer's Fate. The longer you're in combat, the more recovery you get. Think of this as like Wretched Vitality almost, as for a 2-piece instead of a 5-piece. It's incredible resource sustain. I can't recommend it enough if you're playing Vampire Stage 3. You can also go with Marsalok Monster Helm, which is going to be very good if you're going to be doing heavy attacks in close range with all of these proc sets and you don't suffer with resource sustain. Engine Guardian's another good set because it's going to proc a droid, going to give you recovery, but it's not going to give you recovery across the board, just randomly. Balorgs is the best to use for pure raw burst, but I typically like the recovery, especially with Stage 3 Vampire. So here is a chart of what I run: 3 heavy, 1 light, 3 medium, a mace, and an axe, with all weapon damage, enchants, 1 infused, 2 swift. Here is a chart of a secondary option. So if you don't have access to arena weapons, I would run this: Phoenix Moth, Rallying Cry, Sea Serpent's Coil with Roskas. Here's also a Plague Break setup if you want to run this during Mid-Year Mayhem coming up. This is going to be Phoenix Moth, Plague Break with the Markins and Balorgs. All you do for this one is just take off Rending Slash on your skill bar and then put in Whirling Blades for an AoE 360 execute, and you're ready to bomb with this build. Now we got the gear done, we got the skill done. Let's show you how to use this build and what it looks like in combat. So just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use a training dummy. Yes, I know this isn't another player. You've seen gameplay footage of how I've used this. So the first thing you need to do is basically pre-buff. So you want to do your armor buff, and then your Rune Guard, and then I usually do a Resolving Vigor before I go into fight. That's going to give me minor resolve, but it's going to be healing as well before I go in. And then Recuperative Treatises on the front, which is 30 seconds. So essentially 3 buffs you want to maintain before you even start combat. Now, as I close the distance, I'm going to light attack to proc that weapon and spell damage enchant on my back, and then I'm going to do Elemental Susceptibility. This is the laser beam with Vatashram Hollows. Then I've switched to my front. I do this, 1 Rending Slash to proc the status effects, and then I hit them with a flail to debuff them by 5% with the Abyssal Ink. And this is when the target is most vulnerable. When they're at 60, 50, 40% health, this is when you go for the kill. So you don't want to stun someone with Rune of Colorless Pool straight away. You want to use it when they're most vulnerable, when they're low HP, and you got a split second to nuke them down. So when you stun them with this, then you just basically flail spam at close range, hitting them over and over, or Tide King Gaze. Also, if you're running Marsalok, you want to do a medium weave heavy attack to proc that as well. But if you see this, you can just see how many status effects there are. Look at that top bar. The top bar is loaded with status effects. So they're just taking damage passively, shooing through them. And I do this without a high weapon and spell damage because the status effect passive just takes advantage of it so well. Also, if you look at my 5 key on my back bar, you can see that it's like flashy. That's when you have 3 cruxes up and you want to consume them. So remember, consuming or generating crux procs the critical damage passive. So that hit for 13,000 non-crit, and I just want to maintain that. So as I'm passively just working on this, I'm going to see when that procs up, and then I'm just going to use it. So here's a good example of the Tide King Gaze. So I have the 3 proc ready. I'm going, I'm lighting them up, and then I hit them with the stun, Tide King Gaze, lock them in place with Immobilize, and then boom. Tide King will absolutely rip them to shreds. And that's how you use the build. Now we're going to hop over into the CP, and what I use for champion points, I'm going to go over the blue and red. This is a CP add-on called Dynamic CP. We're not going to be stacking a whole lot of weapon and spell damage, but we're going to be going with critical damage and critical healing based on our passive and racial choice, so Fighting Finesse is a no-brainer. Then I'm going to go with 2 damage reduction ones, Duelist Rebuff for single target, and then Ironclad damage reduction for direct damage. And then one last one, since we're going to focus on status effects, Force of Nature, offensive pen for every status effect you have. This is your flex spot. So if you're going to do the bombing, I would go with the Coastal Overload rather than that. If you want a little bit more weapon and spell damage or a little bit more damage to your AoE, you can go with Biting Aura, or you can go with Untamed Aggression. Both good options. Or if you want even more healing, you can go with Focus Mending. So experiment with Force of Nature to see how tanky you are. Next up, we're going to go to the red tree. And so you do want to stack a little bit of HP, but I don't take Boundless Vitality actually. I take Fortified for increased armor, and then I'm going to go with the CC loadout. So crowd control. This is when you're going to be vulnerable when you get stunned to dying. So I'm going to go with the slippery. It gives you a break free for 21 seconds. Fantastic in lag huge heavy fights. I'm going to go with juggernaut. So while you're under the effects of that break free, you're going to get 5% damage reduction. This also stacks with relentless, giving you major protection. So you're going to get a break free, you're going to proc 5% damage reduction, and you're going to get 3 seconds of major protection. So when you're really vulnerable and at your weakest, you'll be your strongest and most sturdy. Experiment with that if you want sustain by suffering for more resource sustain, you want boundless vitality for a little bit more max HP, or if you block a lot, you can always go with bracing anchor over here. If you're slow as molasses, you can go with celerity. For my racial choice, I go with the Khajiit, primarily because this critical damage and critical healing of 12% stacks with the passive built into my class kit of critical damage and critical healing, which also stacks with fighting finesse. So you can get a lot of critical damage and a lot of critical healing just by using the Khajiit. And also it's well balanced, so it gives you max health, magic, and stamina, and a little bit of recovery. I love this. Dummer is another good one with Vampire Stage 3. And also Imperial is a good alternative if you want a little bit of help on the resource sustain department. My attributes, I go with a lot of health, 44 and 20. I like about 34 to 36,000 health. You can actually go 64 into health, and the reason why is the more health, the more healing you'll have with your shield. So don't sleep on health. These are unbuffed stats, by the way. I use the Thief Stone because I'm rocking a crit damage build, and I want a higher chance to get crit damage, and then I use Bewitch Sugar Skulls as my food. Now, as far as potions go, you have a couple of different options. Tripods are going to help you with resource sustain, but you're going to be missing a critical buff. So when you can, assuming you're not out of magic, run the weapon critical to get major savagery. So just make sure you use Essence of Weapon Critical so you have a much higher critical rating than what I do unbuffed. Well, gang, that's a video. I will get to a channel magic range-ish class, or I'll use a bow as my next PvP build, and I'll be coming out with some healers and tank build as well. Check the website. They are updated. I've been playing it nonstop, but this is my favorite Arcanist PvP build. I think it works very, very well. If you got something out of this video, do me a big favor. Hit that thumbs up. Check me out at twitch.tv/Deltiasgaming, where my mom claims I'm the best streamer alive. Appreciate you.